And the other piece of this is that you get to hire folks in with the money to do that. And you can attract those people who've gone through hyper growth before, as opposed to just reaching out and pulling in, engineers that don't have that growth experience. It's a hard thing to find and recruit for. There's a dearth of experience within the space that we've been really grappling with. And I think that once you pull those people in, you've got these engineers that really know the business model, and you can have the benefit of that and the benefit of a person who's got that experience scaling. You put those two things together and they learn from each other.
Hello everyone, welcome to another Hatchpad Insight. I'm Tim Winkler, the creator of Hatchpad, the community for startup technologists. If this is your first time here, don't forget to hit subscribe for updates on new insight interviews like this one. We've got a special episode today. We're looping in one of our Hatchpad community members as a co-host, Mike Gruen, on this interview with Jonathan Sage. So Mike, good to have you.
Yep, thanks for having me. This will be fun.
Good stuff. Why don't we get into it? So Jonathan Sage is the director of engineering at Aledade, a high-growth health tech company headquartered in Bethesda, Maryland. Jonathan, thanks for hanging out with us at the Hatchpad.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. I'm excited about it.
Good stuff. Well, why don't we start with just a quick intro on your background leading up to your current role with Aledade?
Yeah, I've got kind of an eclectic background. I've got advanced degrees in biochemistry and bioinformatics. Ended up kind of going and doing a startup that was doing next generation sequencing analysis, and found that I really loved the engineering piece more than I did the science piece, and completely divorced myself of science and moved into Aledade after that startup cratered. It's been a really big pleasure being part of Aledade as it's grown. I joined Aledade as just a software engineer and have moved up the ranks in the 5 years that I've been with Aledade. I actually joined Aledade through Hatch, so there's a fun little factoid in there for feather in Hatch's cap. It has been a wild ride. I joined Aledade as employee number 148. I think there were about 125 of us at the company at the time. And at this point, we're up to 700 employees, I think. We're spread across the entire United States. I'm in Boise, Idaho. For a really long time, I was the only Aledader in Idaho, but at this point, there's at least 10 of us in the state. It's pretty crazy to see the rate of growth that Aledade has seen, and to participate in it from such an early phase. I've had a lot of ability to shape what our engineering team has done and built out at Aledade.
Yeah, it's exciting. That's why I'm pumped to have you on here. I think it's really great perspective to hear from folks that have been with a startup that has seen that evolution and experienced that growth. So we're really excited about the conversation today. Before we get into it, tell us a little bit about what Aledade's building, what kind of problems you all are solving.
Yeah, so Aledade is a value-based care network provider, and that means that we enable small independent primary care physicians to participate in value-based contracts. And that's kind of a jargony term, and I'm going to go to kind of launch into explaining that. In the American healthcare system, we traditionally have a fee-for-service model, and what that means is your patient gets sick, they go in to see the doctor, and the doctor treats them, and you bill them for those services. So effectively, the doctor only bills their patients for when they need care because they're sick. In a value-based care model, you shift over to trying to keep your patients healthy, to keep them out of the healthcare system when they get sick. Effectively, just make it so they are less sick less often. And what you end up doing with that is that in that fee-for-service model, you've incentivized doctors to have as sick of patients as possible. The sicker your patients are, the more often they need your services, the more often they come in, the more often you bill them. So it's a perverse incentive to have an unhealthy population as a result. And certainly no doctor that I know of has ever intentionally made their population sicker, but the perverse incentive is there. So when you shift over to a value-based care model, you're incentivized to have as healthy a patients as possible, because it turns out that healthy people are cheaper than sick people. So what that ends up working out to is that patients get better care because they're kept healthy as a result of that. They get preventative care from their doctor. There's somebody looking out for them all the time, as opposed to just when they're sick. Doctors get to give the care that they've always wanted to, and they're incentivized to do that. And then the final piece of this is that we achieve this by working with the payers, where we try to drive down costs for those payers. And that means, the insurance providers of the world, your Blue Crosses, your Aetnas, and your Medicares of the world. And you drive down costs for that payer while maintaining as good or better outcomes for their patient population. So you drop costs and keep quality high. And then those payers share the savings that Aledade generates with Aledade, and then we go on to share that back with the providers, the independent primary care providers. It's kind of how our revenue model works. And the last kind of joy of being in the industry of Aledade is that the biggest payer that we work with is Medicare. And because Medicare is our main payer, it means that when we generate savings for that payer, we're actually generating savings directly to the taxpayer, which has been a massive win for driving down costs for the healthcare system that the United States is responsible for paying out on.
Yeah, it's an awesome mission. We also love, the growth story of Aledade. I think of it as like a DC area DMV startup sweetheart. It's one that has continued to gain steam, and we're such a hotbed for good health tech in this area. So I love seeing that mission come to life through the growth of the company. It's really cool. Why don't we jump into the meat of the discussion at this point? So we wanted to talk through this topic of monoliths and how it sometimes has a maybe a negative perception in startup culture versus building with microservices or that next trendy architecture. And as an engineering leader who's grown with a startup yourself, I know that you've got a lot of thoughts on this, and let's dive into that. I wanted to hear your thoughts on this topic, and then obviously we can spitball in a couple of different directions from there.
Sure, I love it. I have a fond space in my heart for monoliths, and it's fun to say that right now because Aledade is literally in the process of carving up our monolith into smaller services and a different architecture. But we've been in a monolith for a really long time. It has served us up to this point in a way that I think any architecture would have served us. I think that a lot of folks set out to solve all of the scaling problems that they're going to have down the line from the inception of the business concept. I think it's a mistake. I think you can get way ahead of yourself on your scaling concerns, and you end up putting a giant anchor behind yourself as you try to develop out the business concept. And as a result, you need more employees to manage that bigger system. It's more difficult and complex to navigate that system for new people coming in. It just ends up being something that slows down the business's ability to expand and grow. And I think the place where I've seen that most prominently is the startup that I was at just before joining Aledade tried to solve all of these problems from day one. We built up this incredibly complicated system that was responsible for spinning up AWS Spot instances. It had an asynchronous thread pool executor for massively parallelizing processing in a way that was non-blocking. It was effectively like a Spotify-esque solution to a company with no customers. And it turns out that slowed us down enough where we were never able to get to a point where we converted a customer over. We ran out of money. And then where are you then? You got nothing. I think focusing on the business, building up that understanding first is the place where I would start any startup at this point with that under my belt at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I've had similar experiences. Whether it was my last place where we went through replatforming prior to my joining, they tried to replatform into sort of microservices or service-oriented architecture. They tried and failed a couple of times, and it was like, no, let's just replatform onto a better monolith than the current thing that we have. I think my experience is very similar in that. Also, people are really bad. Software engineers are really bad at doing premature optimization, picking out where the problem really is going to be. So building those auto scalers or building, this thing where until you actually know where the bottleneck is, your chances are you're not actually solving a real scaling problem that you're solving one that you're trying to anticipate is not as effective as actually seeing where the problems are and then addressing them as you go. I think sort of very similar and related to the monolith discussion.
Yeah. So, we obviously love to bring the conversation into, career development within this community. And, what kind of implications would you say that, these different strategies have on like the career development of your team? Obviously it plays into the recruiting strategy as well, but, what about the career development of your current team?
Yeah, that's a tricky line to tread. So like that startup that cratered, like we had really, really cool technology, and I learned a ton as just a software engineer coming in there from the guy who had architected the system. And I learned about all the tech that was out there, using a messaging service like RabbitMQ, for example, to do processing. It was really, really eye-opening, and playing with Redis and playing with all these tools that like really didn't need them, but I was able to put them on my resume, having played with them and used them in that space. Aledade has gone the opposite route, where we've effectively chosen, boring technologies that are tried and true, and then, as we need them, we pull new technologies off the shelf and add them to our stack. And we're really, really deliberate about making decisions with respect to what we pick and when we pick it and why. And I think that you could have an engineer come in the early days and be frustrated that you're not playing with the newest, coolest, greatest tech that's out there. You have to try to make room for that space. So Aledade has professional development time that's carved out for engineers to be able to go play with whatever they want to, completely unfettered access to whatever they want to play with. And it gives them that space to play with new techniques and technologies. And they can talk to other engineers as they travel through that space. But we're not setting out to have a space where engineers can be like, hey, I want to play with this technology, and suddenly it's part of our tech stack for the sake of getting to add it to your resume. I think it would be a huge mistake to do that.
What about in terms of just sort of the growing of the team over time? I think that that's another area where like the monolith really, in the early days, having a smaller team in a monolith works really well. And then there's a point at which when you start talking about scaling the team and how you've laid out your architecture, that maybe that's when it becomes time. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the joys of it, is that like once you get to the point where you've proven out the business model, like there's a revenue stream that's going to work here, it's a go. Then you go in and you get to play with all that stuff that you've been putting off to the side for a while for the sake of focusing on making the business work. So you pull in new technologies that people have always wanted to touch and play with. One of the things that we recently added to Aledade's stack is we've added Snowflake as our reporting database, which was a massive migration that we undertook over the course of a couple months to shift us off of a Postgres-based replicated reporting database. And it was a lot of fun to go out and investigate all the various technologies that are out there that could potentially have answered that problem space, working with Databricks and going through and trialing out their products as well to see whether or not they were a better fit. And you get the opportunities, an engineer who's walked through the space and has known the business model, like, hey, what is the best technology for me? Not just like, hey, I've used this technology at another company before. You have the time and the money to be able to pause for a second and say, really, what is the best technology? What are we going to be able to leverage for 5 years, 10 years down the line that's going to solve this problem in a long-term way, rather than, hey, I used this before once, it seemed to work. Let's throw it in the stack. It'll solve it for now. And then it turns out that it bites you in the long run because you didn't have people on staff that had the time to think about that problem really holistically. And the other piece of this is that you get to hire folks in with the money to do that. And you can show them, hey, our business works. And you can attract those people who've gone through hyper growth before, as opposed to just reaching out and pulling in engineers that don't have that growth experience. That's a hard thing to find and recruit for. Like looking for folks that have built out things that have really scaled and scaled rapidly. There's a dearth of experience within the space that we've been really grappling with. And I think that once you pull those people in, you've got these engineers that really know the business model, and you can have the benefit of that and the benefit of a person who's got that experience scaling. You put those two things together and they learn from each other. They scale up, they grow, they learn those new techniques and technologies.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think like whenever I think about all the things where I didn't have any experience going in, or we had a more someone who didn't really know what they were doing and was like, I don't know, we just have to figure this out, and you throw an engineer at it. It's great, they learn it, but the fact of the matter is, it's when they go to do it the second time that it's actually really well done. And so, being able to bring someone who has been there, done that, have the money to do that, who can then train and teach, it's not. I feel like a lot of engineers sort of see it as like, well, I really wanted to learn that. It's like, well, now you get to learn it from someone who's been there, done that, and they can sort of help you, guide you, prevent you from making like critical mistakes that you don't realize how bad they are until 3 6 months into the project, and then you're like, oh, I really made a terrible choice. So I agree. I like the being able to bring somebody in more senior later, and really help the whole team scale and learn how to scale. Now you have a whole bunch of people who have that knowledge, that can go out and conquer similar problems.
Yeah, I mean, I can obviously touch on the recruiting aspect of things. The more specifics you keep tacking into that job description and the requirements of what you're looking for, this unicorn engineer out there, the longer it's going to take. So the more your product's going to suffer just from getting momentum and getting that build going. And then there's a flip side of that too, of like you get some engineers in and with the intent that like we want to grow with you. We can get some exposure to some new stuff down the line. That's a selling point. But to have somebody that checks so many boxes, I mean, we'll tell you firsthand that it's unrealistic. And we'll throw some numbers your way too, and making sure that you're aware of like what the talent marketplace looks like out here. This is not a market right now where people can have the luxury of picking and choosing from all of the things that they would love to have maybe immediately. You have to have a little flexibility, and what better reason than for it to play into your business model versus like trying to make something else stick. So um, that's good intel. I think Mike, you may have pitched this as like don't over engineer it. It seems like monoliths get a lot of shade these days, but sometimes it's coined like you're driving the Camry here, not the Range Rover, but not quite the case when it comes to the reality of the business.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Jonathan, if you would agree, but I think like the vast majority of places where microservices make sense, it's like Google, Facebook, these places that have massive scale problems. It makes sense for them to solve the problems the way they are. But like until you achieve, like that's 1%, like of the companies out there, if that. For the most part, most applications, like a monolith is going to be more than what you, it's going to be able to scale up to what you need, and anything else is sort of over engineering. I'm curious, is that sort of what you sort of feel the same way?
Yeah, I totally agree. It's really hard to think about a business that's just getting off the ground, that's already at a point where it needs to start investigating, the horizontal scalability of microservices and the ability of microservices in the sense that you can have multiple teams developing multiple loosely coupled systems. Like that typically doesn't happen. Most businesses don't start out that way from their inception. And it's not to say that they don't and can't. Like there's a time and a place to start there, but it's pretty rare. And you should really carefully evaluate whether or not your business is one that's going to need that type of scaling from day one before you ever go down that pipe. Like as soon as you decide that, hey, that's the direction that we need to head, like that's a giant decision you should make really, really carefully, because once you've made that decision, there's not a lot of backing out of it. Like you've gone down that route, you've investigated and you've invested in that technology, and at that point, like you've slowed yourself down because you need to hire the right people that know how to do it correctly. You probably have to hire more people because you're going to need a lot more DevOps engineers in order to support a system that's as complicated as that. You also have to worry about the fact that you're going to have some drag on just regular engineering. Like as soon as you go that route, you're no longer just cobbling together stuff with a general programming language in SQL. You've got to go and figure out something like Kubernetes, or you're going to have to build out something that's just fundamentally more difficult to run locally. So your ability to develop locally on your engineers' home systems or the systems that you're sending them out is just harder and slower and more complicated. So you end up in a world where you've got this giant drag, and maybe down the line, eventually you don't have to re-architect everything and migrate it over. But was it worth it? Like, was it worth the drag on the business in the early days?
I mean, I think that it's the drag. It can sometimes just cause you to never get to that point where you actually have those problems of scale. And I think, and you sort of alluded to as well, which is the like one of the advantages of these systems is allowing you to have a large engineering team that's loosely coupled and can work on things independently. The downside is chances are you don't have a large engineering team, you have a small engineering team, and now you have a small engineering team that actually has to do a lot more work across a lot more systems. Now you have APIs where and JSON and all kinds of things going back and forth, whereas before it would just be you make this one code change in one place and it goes throughout the entire code stack. You know, you don't have to deal with all the complication. And I think with great flexibility comes a lot of complication, and which just slows things down, as you said.
Jonathan, what's the size of the team that you currently lead?
Yeah, so I have about 25 engineers that either directly or indirectly report up to me. And then Aledade's engineering space, I'm one of like three other directors of engineering. So there's a director of DevOps engineering, and then there's two other directors of engineering, one that's also in the backend space, and then one that's in our, managing our front end applications development as a full stack capacity. So in total, we've got about 60 engineers that are working on this problem space, and we're like literally just now starting to decompose the monolith because we're struggling with the scale that, vertical scaling hasn't allowed us to continue to grow out as fast as we want to. So I think you can go a really, really long ways before you get to the point where you need to shift over. And it really depends on the business too. Like if you've got a whole bunch of front end users slamming your web service all the time, like you're probably going to need to scale that out sooner than Aledade has. Because of the business model that we're in, we grapple with a lot of independent primary care physicians. But when I say a lot, I mean, we've got 6,000 monthly viewers. Like there's not a huge number of users hitting the system on a regular basis. So like that hasn't been our choke point. Our choke point is actually on the data ingestion side. Like we serve millions of patients. So like, yeah, if you had gone and scaled up your ability to handle a bunch of web service requests from day one, you would have built totally the wrong thing, as opposed to going and building up a system that was designed to ingest the records of millions of patients that are hitting the healthcare system all the time. Like Aledade ingests hundreds of different types of data. We're not really what I would call a big data company, or at least this is the way that I used to sell it in the early days of Aledade. Like we're not a big data company in the sense that we're not ingesting like telemetry data all the time of like what's happening, like geospatial data, for example, where it's the same data over and over and over again on a second space cadence, where you have to be able to really handle data quickly and it's a single feed. Like we don't have that problem. The problem that we have is that we're receiving disparate sources of information about a huge population of patients. And we need to take all that information, like those hundreds of different sources, and compose it into a single story that we tell about each one of those patients and deliver those insights to our doctors in a way that's easy for them to digest. So like we're big data in the sense that we've got lots and lots of different sources. And at this point, I think arguably we're big data, just full whole cloth, because we've grown so much. But there was a time where it was just like, it's difficult to tell a concise story about each patient because we've got so many different sources of data. That was our problem space. So like, we need to be able to scale out our ability to reason about multiple sources of data. That's our scaling problem, and the one that we're really grappling with. There's lots of different scaling problems, and you won't know what those are until you're much further along in your business.
Right. And I'd also say that one of the, sort of scaling problems is also just scaling the engineer team itself. It's not necessarily about being able to scale to meet some SLA or SLO. It might just be at this point we've outgrown this monolith because any change requires so much. Anytime we want to do anything, there's just so much interdependency. And so if we could break this up into two separate services so that this engineering team can work totally on this and this one can work on that, and that's a different sort of being able to scale from a productivity perspective. And I think that's where, more often than not, as you're growing as a company, as an engineering team, that's where we've started seeing where it becomes necessary. Like, oh, we're going to carve this thing out. We're going to carve out ETL as its own standalone thing, because it just, that's where a group of engineers can go and tackle that and not have to worry about stepping on other people's toes and stuff like that. Um, I assume that that's also something similar for you guys, Jonathan.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the first piece that we're carving off the monolith at this point is to take our ETL systems and separate them out from our production database that's serving out the front end application. It's definitely the piece that we found it will be most impactful for our ability to reduce latency of our web application for our end users, is to separate those two processes out so they're not impacting each other. And it'll also mean that like we can carve out specific parts of the ETL system and say like, hey, we're going to use this set pattern and do it the same way everywhere across all of Aledade. And we're going to be able to have multiple teams developing that pattern independently of each other, so that we can have all those different data flows coming in a way that's uniform, and we can reason about it as an entire organization. It's easy to onboard engineers more quickly if you do things in patterns, and it's really hard to know what the right pattern is from day one. So like if you've got the time to like step back, pause for a second, build up your framework, and then you start having teams use that framework and just kind of cookie cutter print out the way that you're going to do it across the board. Just it's a better approach.